There are moments in public life that stop people cold. Moments that interrupt the ordinary rhythm of a Sunday morning, freeze an audience in place, and send shockwaves far beyond the walls of any church. What happened on June 26, 2022, inside World Changers Church International in College Park, Georgia, was exactly that kind of moment. Thousands of people had gathered that morning expecting what they had always received from Pastor Creflo, a confident message, a bold declaration, and the familiar energy of one of the most recognizable ministries in America. What they got instead would be talked about across continents for weeks, debated in church circles and online forums, and discussed by religious commentators who struggled to find the right words to describe what they had just witnessed. This is the story of that morning, what truly happened, and why it shook so many people to their core. To understand the full weight of that Sunday sermon, you first need to understand who Creflo is and what he built. Born in College Park, Georgia in 1962, Dollar launched his ministry in 1986 with just 8 people gathered in a school cafeteria. That humble beginning would eventually grow into something almost incomprehensible in scale. World Changers Church International, headquartered in the Atlanta metropolitan area, would go on to serve nearly 30,000 active members. His television program, Changing Your World, reached nearly 1 billion homes across practically every country on Earth. He authored dozens of books. He delivered sermons at sold-out conferences. He built satellite churches and global outreach programs. And through all of it, his name became permanently attached to one specific theological idea: the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel, in its most essential form, teaches that God rewards financial faithfulness. The more a believer gives, the logic goes, the more God returns. Tithing, giving 10% of one's income to the church, was presented not as a suggestion but as a spiritual obligation, one tied directly to both blessing and curse. Preachers like Dollar built massive followings and substantial wealth by preaching this message with conviction and urgency. Dollar himself accumulated an estimated net worth of around $27 million. He owned 2 Rolls-Royces, a private jet, a mansion in Atlanta, and a multi-million-dollar apartment in New York City. In 2015, he famously asked his congregation to help fund a $65 million private jet, framing it as an instrument for God's glory. Critics roared. Supporters gave. And through it all, Dollar remained unshaken, standing confidently behind his theology of divine financial reward. That confidence, that unbroken certainty, is precisely why what happened on June 26th was so staggering. The service began as most services did. Cameras rolled. The congregation settled. The familiar atmosphere of a World Changers Sunday filled the room. And then Dollar stepped to the podium and said something nobody expected him to say. He announced that he was still growing. Those 3 words alone would have been significant coming from any preacher. Coming from Creflo, they were seismic. He then went further. He told his congregation plainly and without hesitation that the teachings he had shared over the years on the subject of tithing were not correct. He said he stood before them in humility to correct things he had taught for years and believed for years, ideas he could never fully understand because he had not yet encountered what he described as the gospel of grace. He said that grace had made the difference. The room absorbed that statement slowly, the way people process something that doesn't quite compute at first. Here was a man who had built a theological empire in part on the doctrine of tithing, a man whose books, tapes, videos, and sermons had shaped the giving habits of millions of people, standing before the cameras and the congregation saying he had gotten it wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in some minor footnote. Wrong in a way that required a public correction delivered to the same audience that had trusted him for decades. The sermon he delivered that morning was titled The Great Misunderstanding. In it, Dollar walked through his re-examination of Scripture, focusing particularly on the distinction between Old Testament law and New Testament grace. He argued that tithing, as a mandatory 10% obligation backed by divine curse for noncompliance, was a Mosaic law concept that no longer applied to New Testament believers living under grace. He cited Romans 6 verse 14 as central to his understanding. He told his congregation that the New Testament is talk about giving, but not through a legal framework of obligation and punishment. Instead, he said, New Testament giving should be a deeply personal conversation between each believer and God, determined by ability, the needs of the community, and prayerful discernment, not fear. He then said something that sent the story careening into headlines around the world. He told his audience to throw away every book, every tape, and every video he had ever produced on the subject of tithing, unless it lined up with the teaching he was now delivering. Think about what that instruction meant in practice. Millions of people had purchased his materials. Families had built their understanding of giving around those teachings. Church leaders had incorporated his lessons into their own ministries. And here was the man who created all of it, looking directly into the cameras and telling people to discard it. The ripple effect of that moment was immediate and enormous. Social media erupted within hours. Clips from the sermon spread across every major platform. News outlets picked up the story. Christian commentators and journalists weighed in. People who had never attended World Changers Church, people who had never purchased a single-dollar book or watched a single episode of his television program, found themselves suddenly caught up in the conversation. The broader Christian world watched with a mixture of fascination, disbelief, and in some cases, cautious admiration.
It is important here to be precise about what actually happened, because in the days following the sermon, the story began to transform in ways that drifted far from reality. As clips circulated and headlines multiplied, some reports exaggerated the nature of Dollar's statements. Some suggested he had broken down in uncontrollable tears. Others implied he had announced his resignation from ministry altogether. The resignation rumor, in particular, spread rapidly through social media and was accepted as fact by people who never watched the original sermon. It made for an irresistible headline. A famous prosperity gospel preacher, having apparently seen the light, walking away from everything he had built. It was dramatic, it was shareable, and it was not true. The verified facts, drawn from the actual sermon and confirmed reporting, tell a different story. Dollar did not resign. He continued in his role as a founder and senior pastor of World Changers Church International. While the emotional weight of the sermon was evident and profound, the resignation story was a rumor, amplified by the speed of online sharing and the human appetite for dramatic resolution. What actually happened was already extraordinary enough without embellishment. The truth needed no extra drama. What the truth did include, however, was genuine controversy, because Dollar's public correction, while significant, was not without its complications. He made clear during the sermon that he would not be apologizing for his past teachings. His reasoning was personal and frank. Without going down that road, he said, he would never have arrived at where he was now. It was a statement that meant something to him spiritually and intellectually, but to many listeners it felt incomplete. You cannot simultaneously tell people to throw away your materials and decline to apologize for what was in them. That tension was noticed immediately and became one of the central points of debate in the weeks that followed. Critics pointed out that Dollar's financial empire had been built, in no small part, on the very teachings he was now denouncing. He had earned millions from books and tapes people were now being told to discard. His congregation and his television audience had given generously based on a theological framework he was revising publicly. David Creflo, the dean of Columbia Biblical Seminary, listened to portions of the sermon and acknowledged what he called genuine humility and careful biblical engagement. But Creflo also raised a question that many others raised. He referenced the biblical story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who, after encountering Jesus, pledged to give back for times what he had wrongly taken from people. Creflo wondered aloud what would have meant if Dollar had invited his congregation to return the materials and receive a refund. He acknowledged it might have been financially devastating, but he said it would have been impressive. That question, whether Dollar went far enough, defined much of the public conversation following the sermon. Supporters argued that the public acknowledgement itself was remarkable and courageous. In a world where public figures almost universally protect their reputations at the cost of honesty, here was a man with a global platform standing before his congregation and admitting that some of what he had taught was wrong. Some of Dollar's fellow Atlanta pastors were less moved. Pastor Michael Clayton Harris took to social media to say that until Dollar demonstrated the spirit of Zacchaeus and provided a refund for materials he was now asking people to throw away, he was not impressed. Others in the broader Christian community agreed. The admission was meaningful, they said, but meaning requires action to become accountability. The conversation also became a referendum on something much larger than one man or one sermon. It forced a reckoning within the wider prosperity gospel movement, a movement that has shaped evangelical Christianity in America and across the developing world for decades. Dollar was not alone in having preached these ideas. Thousands of preachers had taught similar messages. Tens of millions of believers had organized their faith lives, their giving habits, and their understanding of God's relationship to money around these teachings. When a figure as prominent as Creflo Dollar publicly declares that a foundational piece of this theology is incorrect, the implications extend far beyond his own congregation. Other ministers who have followed similar paths now faced uncomfortable questions. Would they follow his example? Would they maintain their positions? Would they stay silent and hope the conversation moved on? It is also worth noting that Dollar was not the first major prosperity gospel preacher to publicly revise his position. In 2019, televangelist Benny Hinn, one of the most recognizable figures in the global charismatic movement, made a statement that drew widespread attention. Hinn declared that he was correcting his own theology and that the blessings of God were not for sale. He said miracles were not for sale and prosperity was not for sale. His statement had generated its own wave of reaction. Dollar's sermon 3 years later felt like a continuation of something larger, a slow but significant reckoning within a movement that had, for decades, operated largely without accountability. For the followers who had been most deeply affected by Dollar's earlier teachings, the sermon produced a complicated emotional response. Some described relief, a sense that something they had quietly questioned for years had finally been acknowledged. Others felt a deep sense of grief for time and money spent based on ideas now being walked back. Still others felt genuine appreciation, believing that the willingness to publicly correct a decades-long position demonstrated the kind of spiritual integrity that should be celebrated rather than criticized. What cannot be disputed is the scale of the attention the sermon received. World Changers Church International is not a local congregation. Its television broadcast reaches homes in practically every country. When a ministry of that size makes a public theological reversal, the entire global Christian conversation shifts, at least temporarily, in its direction. Pastors in Africa, Asia, South America, and Europe, many of whom had built their own ministries in part on prosperity gospel principles first popularized by American preachers like Dollar, suddenly found themselves navigating the questions their congregations were now asking. If Creflo Dollar says the tithing doctrine was incorrect, what does that mean for us? The sermon, titled The Great Misunderstanding, has now passed into the record of modern Christian history as one of the most unusual and significant moments in the recent life of the prosperity gospel movement. It did not end the movement. It did not result in Dollar's resignation. It did not produce the formal apology or financial restitution that many critics felt was owed, but it did something that rarely happens in any field, religious or otherwise. It demonstrated that even the most confident voices, the ones who certainly have shaped the beliefs of millions over the course of decades, are capable of standing up and saying they were wrong. Whether that admission was sufficient, whether it went deep enough, whether it was accompanied by the kind of concrete accountability that genuine correction demands, those are questions that reasonable people disagree about and will continue to disagree about. But the moment itself, a globally recognized pastor standing before cameras and telling his audience to throw away materials he himself